sake from this one. You're lucky. Yeah.
Okay, welcome everybody. We might make a start. Perhaps a few more interested funders will join us, but we'll get underway. Thank you very much for coming on this rather drizzly Tuesday afternoon. My name is Richard Lanane. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Disarmament Platform, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event on behalf of our panellists. I'll introduce in a moment. This is an event about gender and the disarmament diplomacy, and gender has been quite a hot topic this year. We've had, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, the launch of the Disarmament Impact Group of the International Gender Champions Network. We've also had, as you'll see, there have been quite a number of delegations talking about gender issues in various disarmament fora. And so we thought it would be a good idea to have an event to discuss certain aspects of this, because one of the most common questions that come up when I talk to colleagues and diplomats working disarmament is, yes, we're really interested in gender, yes, we want to sort of integrate gender perspectives into our work and so on, but we're not really quite sure in practical terms how to do that. And of course, one way that everyone's quite familiar with now, and Unity is doing some work on, is to improve the representation and involvement and participation of women in disarmament and security diplomacy. And that's obviously a very worthwhile thing to do. It's also good because it's easy to measure. You can look at how many women are in delegations. You can also look at it in a bit more depth as to what proportion of the time women are speaking, how visible are they, how actively are they participating in disarmament diplomacy. So that's good, and that work we hope will continue, and I think Renata is going to say a little bit more about that later on. But we also wanted to explore some other ways that disarmament diplomats in Geneva and elsewhere can do something practical to better integrate gender perspectives into their work. And so, in the same sort of line of thinking as our famous event on gender last year, which also featured Ray and Callum, it's the mansplaining gender and disarmament, we thought it would be a good idea to have an event, again, in this rather light-hearted vein, with a bit of humour, to look at one feature of diplomacy, which is the national statement. It's an ubiquitous feature. Every disarmament meeting features the general debate, with a series of speeches being read to each other. We've had other discussions about how useful that is as a practice in itself, but nevertheless, for the moment, it is a feature of disarmament diplomacy. There will be a general debate, there will be national statements. What is in those national statements? Obviously, is their expression of national policies, of what the country speaking would like to see happen, or what they're proposing, or where they want to go, or what, quite often, as we'll see, what they see wrong with what other countries are doing. And these statements are written in certain ways. Often they're cut and pasted from year to year. A lot of common elements, some would say blah blah. But also there are subtle changes over time, and you see policies evolving, you see ways of describing problems evolving, ways of describing situations, they change, and that carries with it certain meanings, certain implications for international security, but also for the way we conduct our work as diplomats and NGOs and others involved in disarmament. So as I think we'll see today, what goes into a statement can be quite significant, and it shows a lot about the thinking behind the policies, the thinking behind the strategies, and the gendered aspects of that, which I think again we'll discover can be quite significant. But one criticism about gender discussions is they're always very, very serious and heavy, and so we're going to not do that today. We're going to have a light-hearted discussion of a serious topic. And we're doing it in the format, as you've probably seen from the publicity, as a kind of TV dance competition show type thing, where we review the performance and I hand over to our panel of judges who will rate the performance and then discuss the strong points, the weak points, what maybe could be done better next time. Don't take it too seriously, we're just going to have a bit of a laugh, but there are some interesting ideas behind there, I think. And we will also open the floor for the audience. There's not too many of us, so we can have quite a free-flowing discussion Once our judges have had their say, I'll open the floor each time, and you can make your own score. We don't have the panels, the paddles for everyone, but you can still give your own score if you wish. So let me introduce our panel. Firstly, I should get the details. Forget people's names at the crucial moment. Firstly, Ray Acheson, I'm sure most of you will know, has worked for a long time in our field. Ray Acheson is the director of Reaching Critical Will, which is the disarmament wing or arm of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which I'm sure you know is one of the world's oldest NGOs, now what, 103, 102 years old? 103. So a wealth of experience there, both Ray personally and the organisation behind her. And Reaching Critical Will, as well as being an important resource for all of us working in disarmament, of course has a strong interest in gender issues. Callum Watson, some of you may recall from the mansplaining event last year. Callum is the project coordinator of the Gender and Security Division at the Centre for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, DCAF, which is just down the road with us in the Maison de la Paix. I think it's also quite encouraging that DCAF clearly takes gender very seriously as part of its mission in promoting the democratic control of armed forces. And the fact that DCAF has a gender and security division, I think, is evidence of some very serious thought that's going on there about the importance of gender in that aspect of security. So we're very pleased, Callum, you could join us, especially after your crazy travels of the last few weeks. We found the one slot in your schedule you could make it, so that's great. Finally, I'd also like to introduce Renata Delacqua from Unidir, who's been our partner in organising this event, and Renata will speak a little bit later on about some of the other things that are going on in gender and disarmament. So, let's get underway. Panellists, are you ready? We'll begin with the first slide. I'll read it out, and I'm sure you can see it on the screen. I should just say before we start, most of these excerpts, we're going to show some excerpts from national statements. Most of them have been anonymised. We've taken out any reference to the name of the country that's making the statement or any sort of clues. We don't want you to think about who is behind these statements. You know, we're not pointing fingers at guilty parties or people who've done well or badly. That's not the idea. The idea is to look at the ideas that are expressed and the way they're expressed. We're not saying, you know, this country's bad and this country's good. So please don't take it personally or as an insult to your country if you'll hear these slides. There's a couple of them, though, including this one, where the identity was so obvious or integrated through the text that we couldn't hide it. And we're starting with a positive one, so I'm sure the European Union won't mind. The EU emphasises that gender equality and the empowerment of women is an important horizontal priority for the EU, and that the women, peace and security agenda continues to feature prominently in EU external action. Women must be fully involved through active and equal participation, including in leadership in non-proliferation and disarmament efforts. Ray, do you want to tackle this one first? What would you score that as a statement? That's from the first committee this year.
I'm going to give it an
8.
an 8.
Okay, just turn your microphone on.
8.
Solid 8. Okay, Callum, how would you rate that? It's on.
Yeah, I'm going to give it an 8 as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Ray, tell us about. Well, that's a pretty good score from quite a harsh judge.
Yeah, just wait until we get into some of the nuclear ones. Well, okay, what I like about this statement is that it's raising the empowerment of women in particular. It's not just leaving gender equality as a nebulous phrase or catchword, if you will, but it's actually stating something about doing something to promote women's involvement. I also like that it talks about active and equal participation, including in leadership positions. So we're not just getting to adding women to the table, having some faces sitting at the table, but actually ensuring that they are in leadership positions. Where it lost points is that this is really just about women, and gender is much more than just women. It also involves men, non-binary, trans, genderqueer. So there's a whole spectrum of humans that aren't reflected in this, and it's unclear how the EU or this body, if it was anonymous, would see that also being involved in its action.
Okay, good. So, solid performance, a couple of points off perhaps some aspects they didn't think of. Callum, what's your view?
Yeah, I think I would agree as well, basically, with everything that Ray said. I think it's very positive that it talks about leadership rather than just women's participation. Women must be fully involved, of course, and I think people often think this is a moral obligation, but to quote, I think it's Destiny's Child, if you're looking at a state, shoes on your feet, I bought it. Women pay taxes as well, so of course they've got complete right to be involved in these kinds of discussions. And I think the only thing I would say is that you get men who get quite excited a lot about working on gender, but they don't really know what to do. I like to use the kind of puppy dog analogy, so sometimes you need to give men a bone and throw it. So I think it's good when we actually look at statements like this and we think about how men can engage. Of course, men are victims as well. Men are actually most likely to use guns against themselves, so I think that's something that's not explored, but I think it's always good when we give a role for men in these kinds of statements as well, but overall it's a good one.
Okay, so after a positive start, I was a bit curious about horizontal priority. I don't know if there's a gender aspect to that.
I just assumed it's one of those diplo-speak terms that means absolutely nothing in the real world. Is that gender?
I don't know, we can put this to the floor. I see one representative from an EU country here, but Aidan, horizontal priority.
Well, as a native English speaker in the EU, it's always pretty painful negotiating these statements. But yes, horizontal priority is a specific sort of EU term, meaning, to use another horrible term, mainstreamed or a cross-cutting priority or something like that. But yes, I wince a little bit as well, I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on. Another quite positive one, I think. We need political will. This was made in the CD, by the way. I won't tell you which delegation. We need political will to find areas of agreement on where we can make progress in a way that takes account of the security interests of all states. We need to listen to each other and deepen our dialogue and understanding. We need to value and promote diversity in the CD, diversity in delegates and diversity in the countries active in this body. This can be an intimidating room, and we need to create an atmosphere where we are prepared to listen to diverse voices. The pipeline of people who will work on international security and disarmament is being created now. And if we want good people in this field, they need to see that it is a dynamic and creative forum where women and men contribute equally to making our world safer. I mean, this one made me personally quite warm inside. Callum, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm going to give this one an 8 as well. What I like about this one actually is it talks about the fact that we have a problem that needs to be resolved. I think quite a lot of the time I get quite annoyed where you talk about the need to include women, and then people will say, yes, we already do that, and we have Margaret Thatcher as our Prime Minister, so we're really quite progressive on this issue. So I think it's very good that it recognises that there's a challenge that needs to be changed there. Diversity of ideas, it's great. I think it's not just the right thing to do in terms of the fact that we need to be inclusive, but it's also about doing things right. If you get a group of Labradors together and you ask them whether dog biscuits should be free, they're all going to say yes, right? So that's why it's important to kind of mix the people you have in the room so that you have people with different interests at the table. So I thought that was excellent. The only thing that I don't like about it is the emphasis on the security interests of all states. And I think sometimes we lose the element of human security being important as well. And I think we have this idea that the state is this unitary actor. And what I like to do in this particular situation is apply what I was taught in public international law as the Teddy test. Are we treating states like a Teddy? So Teddy likes rum and raisin ice cream. Teddy supports Real Madrid. Teddy isn't so happy when his friends bring semi-automatic weapons to the teddy bear's picnic. Are we trying to, are we really understanding that the state is actually composed of diverse actors? So that's why I docked a couple of points there.
All right.
Okay.
Ray.
I actually was quite favorable to this one. I gave it a 9. Although I might reconsider knock off a half point for the human security argument that Callum just made. I'm very curious, Callum, that you've now made 2 dog metaphors in the last 2 comments. I'm not quite sure if I also need a theme or not, but I'm not really going to have one right now. So where this lost points for me was, first of all, that it's citing the CD at all, because why does that still even exist? But it also lost a bit of points for, once again, reinforcing this binary, just having it women and men contributing equally without any regard for anything else. But what I really liked about this statement is that it went much further than any of the others we have on display today. in terms of accounting for dialogue and diversity. And I really appreciated both of those elements to this. It really is a more feminist approach, I think, to international diplomacy. It's saying that we need to listen to a diverse set of experiences and perspectives, and that we need to work on the basis of dialogue and cooperation. And I think we'll see later on some statements that would be in direct opposition to this approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Yes, it's funny you mentioned that, because coming right up is a slightly different kind of statement, also from the CD, and it runs like this. The need for getting the CD back to work is unfortunately shown by today's biggest proliferation crisis. The nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program of the DPRK threaten not only regional but global stability and security. My country strongly condemns the dangerous provocations by the DPRK and has expressed its disapproval in various multilateral forums. In that light, we welcome the unanimous adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2397. We call on all states to fully implement the restrictive measures towards the DPRK, as only scrupulous and worldwide implementation will make the measures work. In this context, we would like to emphasize that sanctions are not a punitive measure. They are imposed with the purpose to change the DPRK's nuclear behavior so it will get back to the negotiating table. All right, to me, there's an immediate contrast here between the sort of inclusivity and diversity of the previous statements, taking into account the security interests of all states. But here's a state that seems to be, at least to me, to be being treated quite differently. Ray, do you want to kick off with this one?
Sure. I'm hovering between 3 and 4, but it's also a bit difficult to gauge this one because it's our first of the series that doesn't actually explicitly deal with gender. So it's more about the dynamics being put forward in this statement. My issue with this is that this kind of statement and really policy approach to countries that are seen by other countries as misbehaving in some ways, that it's all about carrots, or sorry, it's all about sticks and not about carrots. It's not about dialogue, like you just said, in comparison to the last one. It's about changing a government's behavior on the basis of imposing something or dominating them. So I sort of would encourage governments that are making these types of statements to think about how this sounds, particularly in light of those governments' policies towards other countries who also have some pretty terrible behavior in the world. And there's a lot of hypocrisy that we can see in positions like this around the same issues. I mean, there's these sanctions and this approach to DPRK, but we don't see the same approach being imposed on the other nuclear armed states who have much bigger nuclear weapon arsenals.
Okay, but I mean, the hypocrisy we can recognize, but is there a gender aspect to that, or is the domination of the gender?
Yeah, it's the domination and control that is the approach that's being taken to settle a conflict, rather than the dialogue and cooperation that we saw from the earlier statement, which is a much more feminist approach to solving differences.
Feminist approach. Callum, your thoughts? Your school.
So I gave this one a 4. I was maybe very slightly more optimistic, but I would broadly agree with everything that Ray said. I think this is not an effective approach to kind of point out that there's naughty states and good states. Something then when we look at this kind of thing and we think that, well, this is a gender neutral issue, that there isn't really a gender element. What I found quite interesting is if you actually look in the UN Security Council Resolution 2397, it does talk about some of the gendered effects of what's happening. So it highlights the fact that the diversion of resources of DPRK towards this missile program has a particular effect on pregnant and lactating women because of the risk of malnutrition at that particular point. I don't want to emphasize the fact that women are victims. In fact, it probably also affects men as well, but just to say that there is a gendered element. And I think just to add to what Ray was saying before about this kind of approach perhaps reinforces some of the stereotypes that caused the proliferation of arms and weapons in the first place. If we look at the travel ban that's attached to that Security Council resolution, in fact, it's a list only of men. And we might then want to explore that this link between power and domination, threats caused by men might be perpetuated by harmful stereotypes of the kind that talked about in the CEDAW Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women. So I think it's important that we don't only put gender words into the kind of language that we're using, but we try and act in a way that expresses gender equality and more open ideas of what it can mean to be a man and a woman and to have dialogue and to embrace diversity.
Thank you. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of many of those points. That's the idea. Any questions or comments from the floor on this one? I open it up now because it's the first two slides are really quite clearly, it's clear what the gender issues were, but maybe this one, as our panelists have said, is a little bit more subtle. Just in general, feel free to butt in at any point with your own score and your own comments. If you disagree with the panel, that's absolutely fine. We want to hear your views. Moving on. As I say, most of the slides, the excerpts are anonymous. This one you'll see why it's not. This is the United States First Committee announcing the establishment of a Space Force as a new branch of the US Armed Forces. Obviously, we can't deal with this anonymously, but it's a very interesting, I thought anyway, a very interesting use of language and a good point to illustrate some of the things we want to talk about here. No disrespect meant to the United States or to Vice President Pence. I mean, we're not criticizing the establishment of a Space Force as such, but we just want to look at the way it's being talked about. So, this is, I think it was I can't remember if it was Ambassador Wood or another representative, but anyway, what they said was, why? Why establish a Space Force? As Vice President Pence said last week, other nations increasingly possess the capability to operate in space. Not all of them, however, share our commitment to freedom, to private property, and the rule of law. So as we continue to carry American leadership in space, so also will we carry America's commitment to freedom in this new frontier. Our adversaries have transformed space into a warfighting domain already, and the United States will not shrink from this challenge. Under President Trump's leadership, we will meet it head-on to defend our nation. America will always seek peace in space, as on Earth, but history has proven that peace only comes through strength, and in the realm of outer space, the United States Space Force will be that strength in the years ahead. It fits a certain pattern of speeches that national leaders are prone to make throughout history, I guess. Why don't you kick off?
Okay, I think I'm going to give that one a 3. So this is a bit of saber rattling, or if you might excuse the pun, lightsaber rattling. I'm not sure that there already is war fighting happening in space. We've kind of got what we would call a male gaze, perhaps, or a kind of one based on masculine stereotypes of fighting on what is happening in space already. I think we perhaps need to look less at Team America when we're trying to consider how to write our statements, and look more at movies such as Rogue One, where we actually saw a female protagonist. I think in general this is not very helpful, and I think it reflects back on what I said before, that we need to show in our actions and our approaches, we need to espouse gender equality and inclusiveness and diversity in those kinds of approaches. Once again, we don't see any link to gender here, and we kind of see a form of typical masculinized behavior that is not very conducive, ironically, to the achievement, because they're talking about the need for strength to fight in the domain of space, where actually we've seen at the international level of buildings like this that we need to have dialogue.
Right? Your score?
Gave it a 0. There isn't one, so it's just a blank paddle. I have a hard time, of course, separating this statement from the policy, because the statement is about a particular policy. But I agree with everything that Callum says about the kind of violent masculinity that is embedded in this kind of statement or policy. This idea that strength is equated with the capacity and willingness to use force in all environments, and to be prepared to have the most force possible in order to counter any perceived threat. There isn't any reflection of a different kind of strength, which other countries that develop more collective security models, or there's no reflection of trying to build an architecture for peace in outer space. It says that that we will always seek peace in space, but we're going to build up this force to fight war in space. So it's a bit of a catch-22, and there's no recognition of the efforts that have been made already multilaterally to try and develop new international law, code of conduct, transparency and confidence building norms. That's all out of the picture completely in this statement. The other thing that's not reflected in this statement but would be a result of this policy is the vast amount of money that will be spent on developing this Space Force, and what will that take away money from domestically in the United States in terms of social provisions, and how will that be gendered? That remains to be seen how all that will play out, but we've seen how the expense of the military-industrial complex already has a gendered impact in the United States and a human security impact more broadly. Thanks.
So just to clarify, so there's no redeeming feature in this note? Now we're going to move on to conventional weapons, and we have a couple of statements. We might deal with them together. This first one, they're both about Middle East. So in the past few years, conventional weapons have been acquired and proliferated in the Middle East region in unprecedented quantities and quality. These weapons find their way into the hands of aggressive or oppressive regimes, terrorist organizations, and terror-sponsoring countries, which use them to spread violence and extremism. The threat posed by some weapon systems, once they are in the wrong hands, such as man-pads, short-range rockets, mortars, and surface-to-air missiles, is immense. Weapons in general, and these weapon systems in particular, should only be in the hands of responsible sovereign states, which comply with international norms and standards undertaken by them. And then we'll just do this jointly with the next one. It's also about the Middle East. For example, in addition to nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, a large arsenal of sophisticated offensive conventional weapons of a certain country continues to threaten the peace and security of the region and beyond. These are the weapons that this country uses systematically and vastly for killing civilians, to commit genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity, to violate basic norms, rules, regulations and principles of international humanitarian law, and to breach the principles of morality and humanity. So, bad stuff. But, from a gender perspective, Callum, you go first.
Yeah, okay. Or is it?
No.
Okay, so this one. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give this one. I'm going to give it a 1. So anyone who uses the word man-pad, is going to get an automatic point. So I'm going to give 1 there. I think what I find interesting when we look at gender perspective is the passive voice is kind of the enemy of the gender perspective, because you talk about how these weapons find their way into the hands of oppressive regimes. You know, it's like you wake up one morning and you find this weapon in your hand and you're like, Jesus, where did that come from? And I think sometimes it's important to name the agent, so who puts the weapon there. And then we'll see kind of, I think like Ray was talking about before, this kind of military-industrial complex, they're sold in a certain way. We create these norms where we encourage people through developing certain gender identities that validate the use of weapons. I think there was a really interesting advert you could see in the States that talked about considering your man card reissued on a semi-automatic rifle. So we need to think about why these weapons find their way into people's hands. Why do people choose to use them? So I think it's always more interesting when we begin to write things in the active voice. Also then the notion of the responsible states. I'm allowed the toys and you're not allowed the toys. I'm not really sure how you use a hand grenade in a way that kind of promotes international norms and standards, but I think it's important to kind of question these notions. Can these weapons be used in a way that promotes gender equality? And I'm not sure about you, Ray, but I've not really seen a situation where you've got these kind of feminist fighters fighting the patriarchy with small arms and light weapons. So,
Right.
That was for tomorrow, Callum. All right. I'm also giving it a 1. And the 1 point is because it at least is critical of weapons to some degree. And particularly the second statement in this series talks about genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So bringing in the concept of international humanitarian law and weapons, but otherwise completely agree with Callum's assessment of this statement and this approach to disarmament. This concept of responsible sovereign states as well is often very gendered. We see this in non-proliferation policies where a lot of times those who are considered to not be responsible states are put down in very racist and sexist language, and there's this idea that they're being emasculated by the international community, etc. So I think these statements walk right into that territory and don't really have a lot of positives going for them.
That is kind of a running theme, I guess you've spoken about before. I think both of you mentioned this idea that this stereotypical masculine qualities being strength and responsibility as opposed to feminine being irresponsible and weak. So you'd see that coming through in these.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's move on. Small arms and light weapons, Callum just mentioned. Small arms and light weapons continue to be the weapons of choice in armed conflicts and violence around the world. As a result of this vast scale, they have become the de facto weapons of mass destruction of our age and a dire threat to international peace and security. We cannot just stand idly by. Indeed, the international community can and must work harder to impede the illicit transfer, destabilising accumulation and misuse of these weapons. Ray, why don't you take this one?
All right. I'm giving this one a 4 because I appreciate that it is very critical of the threat of small arms and light weapons and highlights some of the key problems. But I would say that its problem, I'm looking at the wrong one, I think. No, this is right. Oh yes, this is right, sorry. So the problem is in the adjectives at the bottom. Well, one of the problems, illicit transfers, destabilizing accumulation, or misuse, rather than just looking at trade, possession, and use of these weapons, which is the real problem. Who is judging if an accumulation is destabilizing versus we can see all countries accumulating too many weapons, etc. There's also nothing about why this situation came to be. There's a lot of gender analysis around who uses weapons, why weapons are used, why, as we were just talking about with strength, more weapons equal more strength and security in this kind of violent masculinity that dominates in a patriarchal world order. And so there's no recognition or engagement with that situation at all.
Yeah, I think I'm also going to give a 4 as well. I would completely agree with what Ray was saying earlier about the use of adjectives there. Again, I find it interesting how people manage to fall over themselves to not name an agent. So small arms and light weapons continue to be weapons of choice. Who's making that choice? That's not really mentioned there. And I think it's important to not just think about armed violence. They do talk about violence around the world here, but I think small arms and light weapons are often used a lot in civilian context. So here we've got a very state-centric perspective. We're talking about illicit transfers, imagining that we're talking about selling weapons to places like North Korea, but actually we need to consider that when you have weapons in the hands of civilians, then they're going to use them on each other. And there is a gender element to this. Most people who own weapons are men. Often they're used under the premise of protection, but that undermines the rule of law. We want to encourage the police actually to be the ones who provide security in the state, not kind of have this individual game going on. Inherently, they're often used by individuals in civilian contexts against members of their own family. So I think it's quite convenient. Again, we talk about this male gaze, this focus on conflict and mass destruction, but I think it's worth remembering that the mass use of weapons in our age also has a very small-scale context, is being used in homes and communities, perhaps in less visible ways as well. So I'd say that we need to draw that out too.
Okay, look, I'm going to invoke my chair's prerogative here. I think you've both been a little bit harsh on this one. I'm going to give it a 6 because I agree with your criticisms. I think they're soundly based, but still, we can't judge these too much on what's not in them because they've been taken out of bigger statements, which may indeed have addressed some of those points. So I'm a little bit cautious about criticising what's not in something. But to me, I think it's quite a cogent and useful expression of the threat and the need for action. I think your points about picking up the illicit transfer, destabilising accumulation and misuse, I mean, these are the very interesting points from a gender perspective. But maybe this is worth, what would you change if you could change just a few words in this example? What would need to be different to bring this up to like a 6 or a 7? Right?
Well, I agree with what Callum was saying about active voice here. I mean, who's choosing these weapons? This isn't just a passive situation that we woke up with this. So I think identifying some agency for actors would be really important. I think also dropping the adjectives, so that we need to address the transfer, accumulation, and use of weapons, and also production as well, and spending of resources on weapons. Those two things would help.
Yeah, and I think then also just to recognise the gendered impact that it has on people. I think one thing as well, I think we have a tendency to look at the effect of weapons on women in domestic violence cases, so that's one I think that we could raise. But I think another area also is to consider perhaps what effect it has on men as well, what the kind of normative effect of weapons is, what kind of society we want to have. And we do have situations where this illicit flow of weapons will go to young people, gangs, kind of people who are marginalised in society, and they end up being the ones who kind of kill each other as well. So I think it's important to look at the gendered impact that weapons have, not just on women, but also on certain groups of men, and to consider then perhaps how we might mitigate that.
Okay. Maya, did you have something to add?
Yes, thanks. I found this fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm learning a lot. I was wondering this invocation of the mass destruction, whether it does something, what it does there, right? And I have the impression that it attempts to put the discussion onto a different plane, a plane where precisely what you mentioned now, these detailed impacts, gendered impacts, are not part of the discussion. It is about the plane of state security against military might, and strength is understood as in that sense. And in that vein, I'm also intrigued by the use of peace and security. It's always thrown in peace, international peace and security. But what sort of peace is it that is being threatened by illicit, destabilizing, and the misuse of weapons? Right. So it's emptied of all its positive implications. So I just wanted to add that. I'm not entirely sure with how to link this to the gender debate.
And your score?
Yes.
You don't have to score. Okay. So some problems with that expression of the small arms problem. But here's the other side of the coin. These are two statements now. They're not by the same country. They're two different countries speaking, but they have a similar message. So let us be frank and realistic. International transfer of weapons is a fully legitimate activity. It needs, however, meeting certain standards. One of them is transparency in armaments as a key confidence-building measure. Implementation by the states of their export control regulations matters a lot in this activity. And the other state says, the possession, production, and stockpiling of conventional weapons are legitimate sovereign rights that rests entirely in the hands of each state according to its national security requirements. Transfers of conventional weapons remain also perfectly legitimate, provided that the recipient is duly authorized by the government of the importing state, and that there are no limitations imposed by the Security Council. Okay, who'd like to start? Ray, let's take this one.
I gave it a 1. So I think the problems here are similar to what we've seen in some of the other statements that are really celebrating the conception of security being brought through weapons and the kind of violent masculinity, militarized masculinity that we see in these policies that we've already talked about. This statement in particular as well, this concept that, or this assertion that any transfer of conventional weapons is legitimate only with these two conditions. I mean, we have an entire treaty that has a number of other conditions, the Arms Trade Treaty. These cannot be the only things that make an arms transfer legitimate. And then there's the whole concept of legitimate as well, and that being problematic in terms of who's deciding this legitimacy, and again, back to the sort of security equals weapons framework that we're working in. And again, there's a lack of gender, same as with the previous statement. But you said we couldn't talk about what's not there. So, but I would say that there's no recognition in this one really of the impacts of weapons at all, let alone a gendered impact.
Right. You can talk about what's not there, but just keep in mind that it may have been talked about elsewhere in the statement. I think you're on fairly safe ground with these two, just that it wasn't talked about. Callum.
Yeah, so I think I would also give this one a 1. Again, I would really agree with what Ray was saying before. I think this reminds me a little bit of how we once thought about domestic violence, in the sense that a man's house is his castle, a man can make his own rules in the castle, and therefore we didn't see interventions in houses where domestic violence took place as something that the state should do. So I respect your rules. And I think similarly in the same situation here, when we're respecting the state, again this kind of fictional notion that we've created, I think we're overlooking aspects of human security. And I think here we've got the Human Rights Council that has a specific mandate. We've got peer review. We could look at other regional organizations where there is a kind of responsibility to protect. So I think when we see this kind of question, when we see this kind of statement, we have to question, why are we respecting the sovereignty and who are we respecting? So I think what you do here with respecting sovereignty in this way is that you're respecting the rights of those who are already the most powerful in the society to do what they want. Rather than noticing the notion of humanity, where actually it is totally legitimate for people in country X to call out human rights violations in a country Y. So I think this is not something that we're going to wash our hands of. It is an international issue that we need to respond to, and it's something that we need to be able to exercise an element of peer review. Yeah.
We're done? Yep.
You forgot that I spoke.
Okay. We're moving on to a slightly more positive note now, I hope. This one is talking about participation. We would like to emphasize the importance of the full and equal participation of women and men in the disarmament machinery. Research shows that women are heavily underrepresented across multilateral fora that focus on security. But the diversity and differing perspectives makes problem solving more effective. Considering that security is in the interests of all, it is essential that the voices of all are heard. Callum, where do you start?
Yeah. I actually quite like this one. I'm going to give this one a 7. I think that, yeah, security is in the interest of all, and I think that we gain strength by having a more diverse array of perspectives. But again, I'm going to pick it up on the notion of the kind of passive voice. So the notion that women are underrepresented. That's a passive statement. I think it would be more effective if we began to turn that around. So we could say, the people who are already in multilateral fora systematically discriminate against women, and therefore they are not given access to these fora. So I think it's always important to look at where the source is, and rather than saying that it's kind of this, it's this notion that women are affected by gender-based violence. You need to actually solve the problem by addressing what the perpetrator is. Generally it's good, but you need to call a spade, I think.
I think in disarmament we call a spade a handheld earth-moving influence.
Does it have an acronym like MANPAS? Okay. So I gave this one an 8. I really like it as well for the reasons Callum said. I'm critical of it for the reasons he said. And then also the only thing I really have to add onto what Callum was saying is once again, the binary is reinforced here. We're really only recognizing men and women and the equality of them.
I thought it's perhaps less binary than the one we began with, the EU one at the beginning, because it does mention women and men, but then it talks about all, interests of all, voices of all are heard. So that struck me as being quite impressively inclusive. Okay, staying with this theme of inclusion and participation, and we've got a nice link here with the Arms Trade Treaty. So full and equal participation of all relevant actors and stakeholders is also vital for success. Women must be properly represented in disarmament and arms control discussions, negotiations and processes. Their involvement is key to developing and delivering sustainable action. This should be recognised in relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. My country is a strong supporter of the Arms Trade Treaty. Its obligations on states parties to assess the risk of serious gender-based violence or serious violence against women and children before authorising the export of conventional arms is a cornerstone of our commitment to the women, peace and security agenda. I'm quite quite impressed with this one. Callum, what do you think?
Okay, so I think Ray and I can agree that we have a pet peeve. You should never see the word women next to the word children. When you see women and children, and actually there's some academics that use this as a single word, women and children, what you're saying is women are children, right? I mean, just kind of consider that. So they're in the same box there. I think also there's this notion that gender-based violence only affects women and children, only affects the weak, because what does that say? That men are supposed to arm themselves and defend themselves? So I think it's important to recognize that gender-based violence is a larger spectrum. And actually, when it comes to small arms and light weapons, in terms of direct victims, men are 90% of those victims, so it's important to kind of unpack that as well. But otherwise, I think it's relatively good. I think when we talk about women's representation, we just need to be careful that we're talking about women representing themselves, not their children representing them. So yeah, just to be a little bit more clear on that one.
Interesting, yeah. Thanks, yeah, right.
I was slightly more generous in the scoring, but I agree with everything that Callum said. I don't really have anything to add on to that, except binary.
Okay. Binary noses. Any other thoughts from the floor on this one or the previous ones? Do jump in. 8 little bits.
I have a sense I recognise this one. I didn't write it, I have to say, but I do recognise it. The women and children point is interesting. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, because of course in other statements we've talked about women and men without assuming that women therefore equal men. So what makes this different? I mean, I understand obviously that the problems of women and children and men and non-binary people are all different. But I think what we're doing here is talking about specifically in the context of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which does talk about the needs of children in particular, and in many societies, of course, the well-being of women is also important to the well-being of children. So can you just sort of unpack that a little bit more for me, so I understand what's behind all that? Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay. So one of the problem and the differentiation between women and men and women and children is that when we're talking about women and men in this binary, we're talking about the equality between them, whereas when we're talking about women and children and when they're categorically grouped together the way that they are in statements and UN resolutions and even in the Arms Trade Treaty itself, it's as a vulnerable group. And so in this way, women are being equated with children as innocent civilians, as treated politically, socially, legally the same as children, which women are not. And it also is segregating out men from this category, which has also an impact on men in terms of gender-based violence, in this dichotomy between women and children being innocent civilians that suffer and that need protection, and men in this equation are the automatic militants, that it is okay to kill men, and they become more expendable as well. So those are two quick things.
Yeah, I would just add as well, this is kind of my pet issue when we talk about vulnerable women and children. What that says is that the vulnerability is inherent to being a woman and children, like Ray was saying. I prefer to say the proliferation of small arms and light weapons can put different groups of women, men, girls and boys into vulnerable situations, because actually it's gender inequality and the gender norms we perpetuate that create these vulnerable situations. So you imagine someone like Gaddafi was in a very safe situation until suddenly Libya collapsed and he was in a very vulnerable situation. So it was not inherent to his personality as a man, it's the situation that's vulnerable. And actually that's quite positive, because you can then change things about the situation. So I think we shouldn't accept gender inequality. We can fight against gender inequality, and we can make women agents, we can remove that vulnerability, and like Ray said, it's also very important to look at men's vulnerability, particularly when we're talking about armed conflicts. The other thing, actually, when we're talking about Women, Peace and Security agenda, it does talk about women and girls, but like Ray said, they're actually quite different when it's legal. And there is a children in armed conflict agenda, which is separate. And for example, I work on gender equality, I don't work on child protection, and I'm quite resistant about putting those two together, because you need to have specific training to work on child protection, which I don't have. And I think it's really important that we consider that, yes, women and men are seen as a binary. We're talking about gender relations between women and men, and we're looking at working on that, rather than seeing it as men on one side and women and children on the other. So I think when you're looking at the gender picture, you need to look at women and men together. And for example, the language we're using now in our work is women and men, boys, girls, and people of diverse soggy sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And that's the Human Rights Council language, I think, that's being used, I would advocate.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. I've learned a lot from it. Sharon, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just two fingers, kind of. From my experience, every time they say women and children, it means that they're not going to listen to us, they're going to say to us how they're going to protect us. Because children, you protect them, you don't ask them how they want to be protected and how they think that their protection should be happening. And I'm using this platform to say that today women in Israel are on strike because 24 women got killed this year because they are women and because our government decided to vote against any proposal to do something about it. So today is a day of action in Israel for all women for the first time.
Interesting.
And I'm on strike.
You're on strike?
I'm
Sorry,
on strike.
can I ask you not to use the passive voice? 24 women got killed. What? Can you just say what happened?
Sorry?
Who killed them?
Men. They were
Like, this is
killed.
domestic
It
violence.
was 24. Yes, 20. Sorry, my English is. I can't do
No,
politically
no.
correct in English. 24 women that got killed because they were women, not because of terror, not because of. I mean, it is terror, but they were killed because they were women. And the last two in the last week were two girls.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah. And thanks for telling us about the strike.
Thank you. While we're on the topic of women and children, and as we have experts here in the room, I have a question for you. I've been trying to convince some people I work with that we should no longer say women and children. And I've been running short of arguments, but I've been using some of the excellent papers and different documents that Ray has been writing and the ladies at Love. Is it possible to pinpoint the turning point where it became no longer acceptable to say women and children? For instance, in the context of assistance to landmine survivors, at some point it became really no longer acceptable to say that we want these people to be reintegrated into their societies. And we can almost pinpoint the year where it became unacceptable, like this word became taboo, and we had to start saying inclusion for a variety of good reasons, but also because to some extent people like to just change the vocabulary to sound fancy and so is there a way that we can pinpoint when it became no longer acceptable so that I can also use it as an argument with my people when they say, what's wrong with that? We've always been saying that.
I'm not sure that it is considered unacceptable. I think it's pretty routine still to be using women and children, which is why we're critiquing it in this statement. And we hear it all the time. I hear it all the time in First Committee, in the NPT, and in anywhere that deals with weapons, basically. So I'm not sure we can pinpoint that in terms of inside the UN, other than in our work. Me and Callum, and other people that have been critiquing this, other bodies and groups and people, but I don't know that it's at a turning point, unless I misunderstand.
No, I think you understood very well.
Okay.
I mean, academically, earliest was 80s, 90s? Cynthia Adler?
Yeah.
Carol Cohen, was she talking about that?
A bit, yeah. I mean, the critique has been around for a long time, but in terms of it being, that those drafting a UN resolution would say, stop, wait, we can't use women and children. We're definitely not there yet, but that's where we need to be.
And I think the other element as well is that it's kind of women have the right to protection because they have sons, kind of. So, like there's a bit of women only have a right to be protected because they're mothers. So then there's an element of that as well. I think, I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic in the sense that what you see in the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security is the early ones do talk about women's participation in decision-making bodies, and then you eventually see women's leadership and in a meaningful participation. So you do begin to see these shifts in the later resolutions, and I think there is a bit of distinguishing between when we're talking about protection of different groups, women, men, girls, and boys, and when we are, like we said before, talking about, well, who do you consult and when. So really just thinking about how we use the language, I think that is evident in some of the later Security Council resolutions. You begin to see the shift.
Oh, thank you. That's a fascinating discussion, and I'm still learning as I go along through. Okay, we're going to move on to the nukes now. Everyone's favourite big gender issue. And this one, I have several slides. We may not do them all. We'll just take a representative sample. There's a wealth of material out there, unfortunately. So this one reads, we will have to recognise and address the three key motives that drive states like my country to possess nuclear weapons. 1, threats from large military forces, both nuclear and conventional. 2, the existence of disputes with more powerful states. And 3, discrimination in the application of international law and norms, including the failure of the UN collective security system to guarantee the peaceful coexistence of all states. These legitimate motivations are different from those states that retain nuclear weapons as a matter of prestige, either to maintain or attain the status of a global power. There's an awful lot mixed up in this one. I really enjoyed sort of exploring it myself, but Ray, do you want to take it first?
0. And just to spoil the surprise, the next 4 are all 0. So I don't even know where to start with this one. I mean, legitimate motivations for possessing weapons of mass destruction that can be used to commit genocide and destroy entire cities and slaughter civilians. I can't really engage with this idea of a justification for nuclear weapons. I almost gave it a point for comparing and contrasting the legitimacy of these justifications. That at the end it's saying that our reasons for having nuclear weapons are better than your reasons, which I really just found very funny. But of course, overall, again, this is getting back to the violent masculinity conception of security, and we've been talking about this already in terms of conventional weapons repeatedly in small arms. And of course, nuclear weapons are the pinnacle of this. They are the ultimate tool of dominance and control in the world. They are the ultimate tool of the patriarchy in that sense. And so it's, engaging with this idea that there's these justifications about threats and disputes, and that the collective security system has failed. Well, all of this is exacerbated massively by the continued possession of nuclear weapons, by the modernization of nuclear weapons. So to say, like, this is the way the world is, therefore we need these weapons, instead of getting rid of the weapons and changing the way that the world is the fundamental problem with statements like this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm also going to give this one a 0. I think, this reminds me a little bit of my master's thesis, which is titled "My Missile is Bigger Than Yours." I think what we're seeing here is there's also quite a lot of gendered language. So words like larger, powerful, this we kind of think about as this kind of masculine language, and then we talk about collective, peaceful is kind of feminine. So there's a degree of gender in the statement here as well. I completely agree also with Ray that what would a legitimate use of a nuclear weapon be? And I think realistically, if we look at how nuclear weapons were actually used, you can only use them by dehumanizing others, right? So it's kind of that you have legitimacy as men and women, the strong male protector of the state. And the question I've always asked myself is why were there nuclear weapons dropped on Japan and not on Germany? Well, Japanese people don't look like the average American ideal, but Germans might, right? So for me, there's kind of also a racist undertone of there being different levels of state, and I can't really see a legitimate explanation of how you could use a nuclear weapon without having this kind of hierarchy of the good men and the bad men, and the good people and the bad people, and the real women and the not real women, kind of this hierarchy of species. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to intervene again as chair's privilege, and I think you've been a little bit harsh. I'm going to give it 2, because perhaps unwittingly, it does, I think, have a couple of redeeming features. One, I think one of you mentioned, that is, it does at least acknowledge that some reasons for nuclear weapons are bad, and that this whole idea of keeping nuclear weapons as a matter of prestige, or to maintain or attain the status of global power, it recognises that is a bad reason to have nuclear weapons. So, although we can perhaps not be so happy with the fact that whoever made this statement thinks that that's not the reason they have nuclear weapons, of course, but it's often the fact that other countries might think that's a good reason to have nuclear weapons. And the other, so that's one point for that. The other point, I think, is at least recognizing that there is a UN collective security system and that should be taking care of these problems. Now, you might disagree with their characterization that it's failed or that it's not good enough or whatever, and maybe they are one of the reasons that it's failed, or maybe nuclear weapon or retention of nuclear weapons is one of the reasons that it's failed. Nevertheless, this statement does recognize that that's how it should be. We should enjoy collective security through the UN rather than these tools of toxic masculine power, if you want to describe it that way. So I'm giving it 2 points. We have to find some points of encouragement. Let's move on. Ray, I know you like this one best of all, so we'll start with you in a minute. My country is concerned by the development of an emotional and divisive approach. Dividing the international community will not create a climate conducive to nuclear disarmament. In the same vein, developing an approach which is disconnected from the strategic concept, aiming at discrediting nuclear deterrence, can only imperil support for the NPT, which remains the essential basis underpinning international security, non-proliferation, and seeking nuclear disarmament. As it is exclusively based on a humanitarian and, in fact, largely moralistic approach, this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons deepens divisions and tends to undermine the very foundations of multilateralism, namely dialogue and cooperation with a view to reaching consensus. I'm not even sure I dare to give Ray the floor now, but I actually changed it, so okay, good.
I lied. I'm not giving this one a 0. I'm giving it -10. This is actually one of my favorite statements, and it's a recent one. It's from First Committee this year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I mean, let's just take a quick check of the people in this room who identify as women. Who among you has not been accused of being emotional for talking about anything? Oh, I'm not seeing any hands, really? Oh, okay. So when I think about this statement, I would describe it as a master class in gaslighting and victim blaming. I mean, it is the ultimate patriarchal statement. Without ever mentioning anything related to gender explicitly. It's telling us that countries or activists or whomever that wants to get rid of weapons that can destroy the planet are somehow dividing the international community instead of those countries that possess these weapons. That's what we call gaslighting, when you try to turn reality on its head, basically. It's a term, for those that aren't familiar, it's a term that actually comes from a play in 1938 where this man manipulates his wife. It's psychological abuse. He manipulates her into thinking that she's going insane just by continuously denying her lived reality and experience and turning everything upside down in her world. And so I use this term for statements like this because it's sort of it's trying to distract from the reality of the thing, and it is also a good example of victim blaming in that it says that the other person, the one who's challenging you, is the one that is causing turmoil, that is upsetting the international order, that is creating some sort of problem. I particularly like in the last paragraph how it says that those who are trying to develop things like international law are undermining dialogue and cooperation, and this is being said by government representatives who have massive nuclear arsenals and who are continuously shutting down dialogue and efforts to cooperate, who are boycotting conferences and discussions, who are refusing to engage in new initiatives or setting up competing initiatives at the UN, and are ultimately the ones that are working against any kind of progress. Thanks. Sorry, was that too emotional?
Hysterical, right?
Yeah, well, I think you're undermining the foundations of multilateralism. Callum,
Okay,
if you give this one 10, it'll come up to 0.
No, I'm going to give it a 0 as well. I can't really do it justice after I think what Ray said there. But there's a couple of other points I'd just like to highlight. We talked a little bit about implicit bias and things that we don't always immediately see that's happening. By describing, approaches exclusively based on humanitarian and moralistic approaches, we're trying to kind of undermine those two concepts as something perhaps a little bit feminized. So I think we need to be careful when that kind of thing goes on. The implicit assumption there is that yeah, humanitarianism is nice, but actually what the real power is about might and military power and that kind of thing. So we need to be careful a little bit about what's happening there. The other thing I find interesting, it relates to Ray's point on gaslighting, is I think there's often an ignorance in these kind of situations with regard to who actually provides security for who. So many people think, well, who protects the population? They'll say the armed forces, they'll say the police. But you ask particularly women, but also men from the homosexual men and that kind of thing. How do you ensure that you get home safely at night? What do you do? Like when you go home safely at night, you say, call me when you get home, right? So actually women look out for each other, and I think here the other element is this kind of arrogance and a blindness to how international security actually works. That actually most people look after their own security most of the time, and a lot of the time particularly discriminated or oppressed groups look out for each other, and I think that's kind of ignored here. There's an idea that actually military security is actually the basis of international security, which isn't really true.
Okay, so some harsh judgments there. Would anyone in the audience have some other views of this statement, or some perspective that's a little bit different? Again, we have to be a little bit careful. It is of course sits in a much longer statement, so we've picked out the juicy bit, but nevertheless, I think it's reasonably representative of the whole statement. For me, it was that second paragraph that really, well, there's the emotional thing, which of course, I don't know who drafted that, but I think we can just class that as a mistake. But the second paragraph is, to me, very interesting, and this conflation of somehow it's the humanitarian and moralistic approach that is undermining multilateralism, dialogue and cooperation. I mean, like these things are somehow mutually exclusive. And I think most people, just at face value, would say, well, if you had to sort of group these words together, you'd put humanitarian and moralistic together with dialogue and cooperation. And these are things that kind of support each other. So it's an interesting attempt to kind of just turn things inside out. And I think, Ray, you're right, that gaslighting is perhaps the best way to describe this one. Any thoughts on how this could have been done better? I mean, you've both just panned it. Let's play devil's advocate a little bit here. You are representatives of nuclear weapon states. Obviously, you're not going to be able to change that overnight. What would be a better approach here? Realistically, if you're a delegate within the constraints of your overall policy, you're retaining nuclear weapons. You're a state party, nuclear weapon state party for the NPT. You don't like the new treaty. But within those overall constraints, how would you sort of approach this approach better?
Well, I kind of want you to answer that, because I feel like you've tweeted that several times in tweeting out some of the nuclear armed state statements and providing what they should have said instead. But I mean, at least this section of this statement, and if I remember the whole statement, it's all pretty bad, would need to be scrapped and start over. But I think there's I can't really like line by line edit this one because it's too wild. But I guess if I was trying to defend the position but not be part of the patriarchy in doing so, then I guess I would leave out all of the language about emotional stuff. I would leave out anything that suggested that the non-nuclear armed states were doing anything wrong. I would not belittle humanitarian or moral approaches to these issues at all. In fact, I would acknowledge that they have a strong point, and that's exactly why we need nuclear disarmament and why we need to work together as a community to achieve that. But I'm finding this exercise extremely painful. I don't like it.
You can stop now. Callum?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Ray's saying. I think another thing is there's a kind of might is right tint to this statement, and I think something I find interesting is often levelled at me working in gender equality is people say the problem with you people in gender is you never agree on anything, and actually you could say that about the two of our organisations, that we often don't agree on we agree on this one, yeah. We don't agree always on approaches, but I think we need to move beyond the notion that there's only one solution. I think that we know with nearly any solution that we found is that you try a whole series of different things and you see which works. So I think I would reinforce what Ray is saying about not denigrating humanitarian and moralistic approaches, but also saying, you know, we all want to work in a more peaceful world. We all hope to work in a situation where we won't need nuclear weapons, and we welcome a diversity of different approaches, different ideas, diversity of opinion on how to move forward towards achieving that. So I think welcoming people who ultimately have the same goal and recognizing that rather than directly confronting them, and kind of respecting diversity of opinion, I think is a more a positive approach if you have that particular position.
Okay, I mean, I would agree, and as Ray mentioned, someone certainly has been tweeting suggestions to the P5. They haven't yet taken them up. But it's just to go off on a slight tangent for a minute. It is, to me, at least, very fascinating the way that the nuclear weapon states, or the nuclear armed states in general, have responded to this kind of what they clearly perceive as a challenge posed by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the whole humanitarian initiative that led to that treaty. Because that's a story worth looking at in itself. And just to give a bit of a sort of pre-advertisement for an event we're planning early next year, we'll be looking at those reactions from the nuclear armed states and sort of why they reacted that way and what they hope to achieve and whether it worked out for them or not. So, date to be announced, but we will be looking at that in more detail because I think it's a fascinating story.
I hope you'd also be thinking of asking one of the nuclear armed states to come along and participate.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, it wouldn't be fun without one. Maya.
Yeah, I was struck by something else in this statement in the end there, because somehow its redeeming feature to me is the valuation that it values multilateralism, dialogue and cooperation. But it doesn't value them as such, but as a way to reach consensus, which then these precise states have the power to block. So, but I think if that was truly something that is valued, then therein lies an opportunity. What concretely is that state doing to promote multilateralism, to support multilateralism, dialogue and cooperation? And following on to your question, Richard, before, so from the discussion I get the impression that states that rely for their security on nuclear weapons, that have an approach to security that is state-oriented, oriented about the dominance of others through military means, and so that's not something that an individual diplomat can change in the short term. And to bring this back to gender and its manifestation in these kinds of texts, I am wondering, I would be interested in your views, is it better then to use the words, to use active speech, to say participation or equal and meaningful participation must be promoted and so on, to do all the things or some of the things that we have discussed here, or is this merely providing a smokescreen for a deeply paternalistic or patriarchal structure that is being perpetuated underneath?
Good question. The smokescreen. Callum.
Yeah. I think most countries are democracies, and I think it is important. There's a whole set of civil society organisations, and I argue that Ray works for one of them, that do hold states to account. So I think, yes, it can initially appear as a smokescreen, but I think there are civil society actors, other political actors in those different countries that will then hold that government to account to do that. And I think there is a kind of normative effect of people using language. I'd say that I often do training actually for the British government, and you can say positive or negative things about the British government's approach to gender equality, but what I'd say now is that everybody understands that we need to talk about gender. And we used to have kind of the coalition of the willing, like 12 people turn up to gender training in the Foreign Office, and now it's full every time, it's 40 people. So I still think yes, it might be considered as a smokescreen or as a tokenistic gesture at the beginning, but I think these are tools for states to be held accountable to what they're saying, and you know, things don't exist in a vacuum, and an effective security sector has this whole ecosystem of different actors that work together.
No, I would agree with that.
All right, I had a couple more slides on nuclear weapons, but I think we've really covered the main issues there, so we might stop with that. I'm sure you're getting tired. And if there are no further comments on the slides we've seen or the issues we've raised, what I'd like to do now is invite Renata Delacqua from UNIDIR to tell us a bit more about what UNIDIR is doing and what the Disarmament Impact Group is doing. So again, the whole idea of today's event and all our efforts are to help you as diplomats and officials and NGOs find ways to better integrate gender perspectives into your work. And Renata's going to speak a little bit more about some other channels for that. Renata.
Hi, thank you, Richard. Yes, I think we are all encouraged by the interest that states and the disarmament community has shown in integrating gender into their work. I take note of what Callum was saying, that the room is full. Here at UNIDIR we have a gender and disarmament project that we are actually expanding to become a program, because that's something that has been considered very helpful by the states. And so we are producing data and analysis on how gender balance fits or doesn't fit the scene here. But we are also trying to work together with states in supporting them to integrate gender perspectives in their work. And this is the Disarmament Impact Group that was launched in September this year. You probably seen me around in different meetings trying to call attention to a couple of specific things that states can do in moving from words to actions. I think we have still a lot to improve on gender-sensitive language, and also on changing the institutional culture where we operate. And the International Gender Champions just launched a gender-responsive assemblies toolkit. It's a very extensive document. I'm actually working on making it a bit more brief and direct, and we actually want to work together with the chairs of different meetings on how to make the institutional culture more gender responsive, and see where there are opportunities for states to adopt even like time-bound targets, create chains of accountability, and publicize their numbers and their initiatives, so that, as in democracies, you know, people can take ownership of that and also work together with the countries to improve that. Yeah, so I'm very excited about today's event, where we had this willingness of states, Ambassador Aidan Liddell, you know, engaging and we exchanging different views. I think that's the value of diversity. Diversity not only brings different perspectives, they actually make us examine our own perspective, and that's also a very important thing. And UNIDIR has been doing work on the value of diversity in multilateral for some years now, and that's something we believe in. And yes, I guess from our side, just know our door is always open to work towards gender equality, women empowerment, and making our diplomatic scene more gender responsive. Thank you.
Thanks, Renata. And I think the theme there is words to action. So finding ways to put these ideas into practice and make a practical difference. Final couple of words before we wrap up, Ray?
Yeah, well, I really liked this event and the opportunity that it offered us, and thanks to everybody who participated from the audience. It was really good to have some feedback and some dialogue on these things. I like the approach of humor. I thought the mansplaining event last year was very good, and so I hope that we can keep doing more of these.
Yeah, no, I'd like to reiterate that as well. I think that often when we're working on gender equality, I don't know if I want to use the word emotional, but it's an issue that shakes people, both women and men. Actually, it probably shakes men a bit more than women because often it's kind of a more of a new topic to men. So I think considering the context of how you look at gender equality is really important. And so I really also appreciate this event. And I would say that, you know, when I'm actually working with states or different organizations on revising their policies, I might take a slightly different approach of, you know, compliment, criticism, compliment. It is important to, you know, consider that as well and how you overcome resistance. But yeah, I'd like to thank you all for being here and for being open-minded. I'm not asking you to agree with everything we said, but I hope we provided some food for thought, and I'd be happy to continue the discussion over time. So thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you both panelists very much, and thank you, Renata, also for your support for this event. I've enjoyed it tremendously myself. Thank you to the audience who've joined in as well, and those who didn't join in, we hope you found something useful to take away, maybe to discuss with your friends and colleagues. You know, I'm the one who collected the statements and went through them and organised them and worked out the themes, but even having done that, I've still learned an awful lot from our two panellists. They really illustrated some aspects that I really just hadn't thought of at all, and showed some other angles to things that I had thought of but perhaps hadn't fully considered. So thank you both again for joining us. Thank you all. We will continue this work in cooperation with UNIDIA and anyone else who's interested. If you or your mission would like to do an event on gender and disarmament or anything else in disarmament, we're at your disposal to help with the logistics, to help you find speakers, to discuss how to best to make an event. Really, GDP is something at your disposal to help you do your work. So thanks again, and wish you a pleasant afternoon.